Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 14th of November of 2023. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first we're going to talk about Avdiivka area. Today we had a lot of very interesting details and updates. According to the report of Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation, as a result of clashes on Donetsk direction, the Ukrainians lost 300 soldiers, 5 armored vehicles and 1 artillery system. As you can see, the level of losses on Donetsk direction is still very heavy. On these scenes, on this footage, you can see the bombardments of the chemical plant. Obviously, now we understand that the Russians are not going to make a very wide and big encirclement by taking like Stepovo, Berdichi and moving further to Mansk. The Russians are not going to take Pervomaisk and Itailova. The Russians took a decision to use a very short way how to take control over Avdiivka. And basically the Russians have already launched the attempts and launched the first attacks to establish control and to enter chemical plant. But before that, of course, they need to make artillery preparation. The Russians managed to establish a very strong foothold in along the railways and in the central and in the eastern part of Stepovo, and for now we haven't received any updates regarding the attempts of the Russian forces to continue advances further to the west. So basically, maybe because of bad weather, I'm not saying that the Russians will not restart their offensives as soon as the weather comes, good weather comes, but for now the Russians are trying to hold these territories, and now the Russians, the only thing they're doing is repelling the Ukrainian counterattacks that the Ukrainians try to make every single hour, because the Ukrainians understand the value of the foothold on the north of chemical plant. When talking about Avdiivka itself, today we got a lot of updates regarding the Russian progress, and the most important updates are coming from the north in the vicinity of the Terikon and from the south in the industrial area in front of Yasinovata. First, let's start about the north. Today we got very interesting geolocation, how the Russians were bombing and attacking the Ukrainian positions in industrial area that located on the east of a chemical plant on the southeast of Terikon. We got this update somewhere at 3 p.m. of the local time, and right before I start making this video at 9 p.m. of the local time, the military expert reported that as a result of a very powerful and unexpected offensive operation, the Russians managed to enter this industrial area and basically to establish control. Currently, and during upcoming night, the Russians are going to finish the clearing operation and to repel possible Ukrainian counterattacks. Obviously, the Ukrainians will counterattack because this is a strategical point. Because if the Russians are able to save control over this stronghold in having positions on the Terikon, the Russians from now on are able to cut and establish fire control over the road that goes from Avdiivka chemical plants to the eastern part to this residential area. And obviously, if the Ukrainians are not able to counterattack and to restore control over this industrial area, the Ukrainian fortifications that located in this, let's say, white gray cloud will be collapsed automatically. There are no chances to hold this territory because there are just fields, and the Ukrainians can support this territory or from the central part, or they could support this area from a chemical plant. So we're gonna see what is going to be next, because this night the Ukrainians obviously will try to counterattack this area, but it's not a very easy job because currently the Russians control the situation from Terikon. They have established control over every single road, and they can use the FPV drones and anti-tank missiles and just regular mortars to attack the Ukrainians. Obviously, the Ukrainians don't have possibilities to use armored vehicles. The only way to redeploy from one side to another, they can use just infantry on their own feet. More updates are coming from the southern part. Today we got 2 videos from this direction. First video was published by the Ukrainian forces, to be more precise by 110th Mechanized Brigade. On this video we can see how the Russian tank entered the industrial area and was attacking the Ukrainian forces from very close distance. We see complete absence of counter-artillery attacks, of artillery support from Ukrainian forces. The only thing we see is how the Ukrainian Ukrainian one drone was flying above the tank and making some video trying to provide the geolocations and coordinates to the main Ukrainian forces, and we got just one video of a strike with FPV drone. So this is the only thing we got from the Ukrainian side. Later at 5 p.m. of the local time, we got the same video but from the Russian side. On this video we see how the lone Russian tank entered the industrial area. As you can see, there are no artillery bombardments, there are no mortar strikes, everything is calm as the spring day. Nothing, nobody can resist the Russian pressure. There is no Ukrainians, let's say, in the buildings, or they basically don't have a weapon to fight with tanks. The tanks entered the central part easily and started bombing and attacking the Ukrainian positions. So we see, as we discussed in the previous videos, that this area will be collapsed. Obviously, it's just a matter of time, not the matter of whether the Russians are able to do this or not. And the main reason why the Russians can do this is complete absence of Ukrainian artillery battles, artillery bombardments with 155 millimeters rounds, or using the multi-launch rocket systems or something like this. The only weapon the Ukrainians can use is FPV drones, but it's not 100% solution for such cases. Anyway, the Russians will continue advances and will continue offensive operation further in direction of the central part of Avdiivka. And as I understand, the upcoming days we're going to receive more updates from this territory. And when talking about this area, the first goal, the first step of the Russian forces is to establish control over this territory. And if the Russians can do this, obviously the Ukrainian fortifications that located on the north from this area will collapse automatically. And first of all, I'm talking about this industrial area. There's some water pump station, because this water pump station has support using this road. And if the Russians can capture this territory, of course, the first thing they're going to do, they will send their forces to the north. You need to understand one important thing, that this Avdiivka is a well-fortified area. The Ukrainians are here since the beginning of, since the 2014. But the main problem of this area is that there are no defense belt inside of Avdiivka. Most of the Ukrainian defense belts located on the outer ring of Avdiivka. So we can say that there are very heavy fortifications, let's say in this direction, let's say along the railways, let's say along this industrial area. There are very heavy fortifications on the west of this pulp station. There are very heavy fortifications along the road between Kamyanka and Krutaya Balka. There are very heavy fortifications in the south of Vysole. So this line is well fortified, this one, red line. But if the Russians are able to penetrate this first defense belt, then there are going to be just the regular communication roads, regular underground tunnels, regular supply roads that Ukrainians were using under the Russian, let's say, bombardments. So that means that you need to penetrate the first defense belt, and then the entire situation is going to be much, much easier in comparison with the current situation. And now we see that, for example, on the northern part, the Russians have already penetrated the defense belt and enter the industrial area, and after that there are going to be less barriers in front of the Russians. When talking about the southern direction, we can see here the same picture. As soon as the Russian penetrated the first defense belt, obviously then it's going to be much easier to move further in this industrial area, in the residential area, in direction of Tsarskaya Okhota behind. So there are just communication roads, and the Ukrainians understand this situation also, but for now they still haven't found any solution how to prevent the collapse of Avdiivka. The only solution they have is to send more and more reserves and reinforcement, but we understand that this will not help, because if the Ukrainians send here more reinforcements, obviously they will be forced to take them from somewhere, let's say from South Donetsk direction, or let's say from Zaporozhye area, or from Kherson direction, and so on. So we see that the Russians do have some progress on the south. The Russians do have some progress in Stepovo, Petrovska. The only area where the the Russians have some problems is the area on the south of Tonenka and Severnaya. There are a lot of mines, the fields are under complete Ukraine control, and currently the Russians do have some problems. They still haven't managed to establish control over this territory, and so obviously they need to do this to be synchronized with the main forces on the south and on the north. But we'll see what kind of solutions the Russians are going to use to take control over Severnaya and to get inside of Tonenka, because this is also a very important area, and the Ukrainians at some point can redirect their defense, their logistic roads, and to reinforce their positions in Tonenka and Severnaya and to hold this area as long as possible, because this is also a key region for the Ukrainians. Furthermore, the Ukrainians today published a lot of videos how they were bombing and attacking the Russian artillery systems in the vicinity of Avdiivka. Those artillery systems that were supporting the Russian offensive forces on the south in the industrial area. As a result of those FPV drone strikes, the Russians lost at least two artillery systems and one support track. Now we're moving to the north in direction of Artyomovsk, Bakhmut direction. We also got a lot of updates, and we can say that the third battle for Klishchiivka has started. As we discussed, I'll remind you that during the 2022 and the Russians under the, let's say, using Wagner forces captured this territory for the first time. And that opened the Russians the way and the gates for further offensive operation in direction of Ivanovska, and to that attack allowed the Russians to establish fire control over the roads between Chasov Yar and Bakhmut. The second battle for Klishchiivka took place this summer when the Ukrainians were counterattacking, and as a result of Ukrainian counterattacks, they managed to establish control over the hill 205.7, and the Ukrainians managed to get as close as possible to the railways and to establish control over Avdiivka. And now, due to the critical situation of the Ukrainian forces all over the combat lines, the Russians launched the counteroffensives. Yet I don't know for sure what are the real purposes of the Russian attacks in direction of Klishchiivka and in direction of Avdiivka. I'm not sure that the Russians are planning to counterattack, to, let's say, to encircle Chasov Yar from the south and from the north. The only explanation I have, at least for now, the Russians have few targets. First of all, few layers. Target have like few layers. First layer is to force the Ukrainians to keep some a significant number of reserves in this area and not so the Russians to capture these villages, because it's, first of all, it's a media victory when talking about Ukrainian side, and of course the Ukrainians can't allow to lose this bridgehead where they spent so many blood of brigades like 5th Assault Brigade, of 93rd Mechanized Brigade, of 22nd Mechanized Brigade, of 80th Air Assault Brigade, of 3rd Assault Brigade. Too many soldiers, too many young Ukrainian people were killed, who died during the battle for this area, and the Ukrainians basically don't have the right to step back from this territory. So that's why the Russians understand that they will keep a significant number of forces, but not to allow the Russians to retake control over these villages and over these strategical points. And this is exactly what the Russians need. They don't need to have like significant pressure, they just need to attack every single day with the small waves, with the short amount, with a small number of soldiers in each group, just like 4, 5, 7 points of pressure just to enter the combat line, to use the grenades, to use machine guns, to use, let's say, FPV drones, and to step back. And the main purpose of Russian attack is not to capture the territories, but to reduce the Ukrainian manpower. 1, 2, 3 killed soldiers, this is good result, and you can step back. And to make some reconnaissance. And the main focus on these attacks the Russians are doing on the usage of FPV drones and artillery bombardments. There are no like tank attacks, there are no let's say personal carriers with infantry attacks, just the distance attacks, but every single day. When talking about the northern direction, the situation is here a little bit different from the situation from the south. As you can see, I have updated the map showing that these 3 lines are under Russian control. Today we got some geolocations from the Russian side, the updates how the Russians were clearing these trenches and how the Russians were establishing control as a result of, let's say, offensive operations. And now we have like 100% proofs that the Russians at least captured this tree line. We have the video of TOS flamethrower bombardments of this area. That was something like artillery preparation. When talking about this territory, the Russians probably have more plans, and probably they're planning to achieve some results and to get very close, and maybe even to establish control over Khromovo and to get to the outskirts of Ivanovska from the north, and probably to enter the outskirts of Bogdanovka. But for this, first of all, of course, the Russians need to continue advances further along the railways to clear this territory, and then this might change the entire situation on this area. The Ukrainians also try to slow down the Russians as much as possible using FPV drones. Usually, as we discussed on this stage of the war, special military operation, both sides, either the Russians and the Ukrainians, mainly use armored vehicles as a transport equipment. And when they get the combat line, usually either the Russians and the Ukrainians abandon armored vehicles, and then FPV drones destroy that abandoned equipment. So the clashes on the northern part of Bakhmut continues, and probably the results are going to be also very interesting during the next weeks. One more time, when talking about Bogdanovka, there is the same situation as we have in the vicinity of Avdiivka, at least when talking about the northern part. The Ukrainians have just one defense belt, and this like the edge defense belt that goes, let's say, from Orekhovo-Vasilievka, Grigorievka, then Bogdanovka, then Khromovo, then Ivanovska, and that's it. So maybe few defense belts, like few trenches, few layers of fortification, but there are no deep fortifications like almost every single 100 meters almost till Konstantinovka. At some point, the Ukrainians are no longer have the real fortifications, and if the Russians do have power, if they feel that they can penetrate 2 or 3 defense belt that located very close to each other, then they're gonna have no barriers to move further, even in direction of Chasiv Yar, and maybe even to enter the city. So we'll see whether the Russians are able to do this or not. Very interesting updates are coming from Liman and Kupinsk direction. For example, when talking about Liman, the Russians reported that as a result of clashes during the previous 24 hours, the Ukrainians lost 210 soldiers. A day before, yesterday, the Ukrainians lost 150 soldiers. On the 12th of November, the day before yesterday, the Ukrainians lost 210 soldiers. So currently, based on the Ministry of Defense report, there are very heavy clashes on Tarskoye salient in Kremenная forest along the Zherebets river, but to tell the truth, we don't have almost geolocations. This is probably the only geolocation from this area for a very long time. Mainly geolocations were coming from Kremenная, but and this is very weird and very strange. Obviously, the clashes are taking place in front of Makeevka and Terny, but we don't have nothing to show, so let's wait. Maybe after the Russians are able to get some results, we will see some footage and some scenes from the ground. When talking about Kupinsk, we see the same story. The level of losses of the Ukrainian forces is very heavy. 155 soldiers just for one day. Yesterday, the Ukrainians had losses 160 soldiers. The clashes are taking place in the same areas on this square between Ягідна, Ивановка, Степова Новоселка, Кисловка, Котляровка, Першотравнево, Орлянка. So the clashes are taking place in this area, and today the Russians published another video, how they were clearing and taking under control the trenches that located in front of Ivanovka. This is a very weird and probably the strangest area in the entire special military operation, because since the creation of this configuration of the front line, the Russians are taking this position probably for the 5th time. At least as I remember, correct me if I'm wrong, I have at least 5 times geolocations how the Russians were clearing and attacking this area. Probably every time the Ukrainians had possibilities to counterattack and to force the Russians to step back. So anyway, this is another confirmation that the Russians are currently located right in front of Ivanovka, and maybe they have finished the final preparation before the next wave to attack in direction of of village itself. So we'll see, because sooner or later someone is going to win this battle, and if the Ukrainian wins, obviously they will counterattack further and they will attack Yahidne and Zatishye. But if the Russians wins, of course they will continue their offensive operation further in direction Stepovo-Novoselivka. Maybe the Russians haven't launched an assault operation of these two villages because of some problems to the north of this area, on to the south of Pershatravneva. Today we got more geolocated videos of the loss of Russian forces. Significant number of infantry and soldiers, armored vehicles were destroyed by the Ukrainians during the Russian attacks. If we increase the number of days since the beginning of November, we see how many skulls in this area showing the results of Russian attacks. Lots of losses, lots of armored vehicles, lots of tanks, infantry, the Russians waste during those attacks, and now there are problems. But as I understand, according to the timings, the Russians should have already bypassed this territory and to reach, let's say, the northern outskirts of Stepovo-Novoselivka, so they should have already established control somewhere like something like this, but they still have problems, and they continue doing their offensive operation. When talking about Sinkovka, we haven't received anything from this direction. If you remember, yesterday we discussed that some Russian sources reported about the Russian entrance in the city and the village, but yet we haven't received any confirmation of that. Now we are moving to the southern directions, and first we're going to start with Kherson area. As you can see, significant number of icons telling us that there were very heavy clashes during the previous 24 hours. The Russians continue bombardments of Krynki. We continue receiving every single day 2, 3, 4 geolocations from this territory. The Russians continue bombardments of Krynki with Toslem towers, with guided bombs and so on, but yet the Russians haven't managed to force the Ukrainians to step back from this territory. And the reason of that is the same as some problems in Avdiivka. The weather is very bad. There is a fog above this territory, there is a fog above Dnipro, and the fog allows the Ukrainians to send significant number of reserves, and these reserves are invisible for the Russian drones, for the Russian intelligence. And of course, as you can see, there are a lot of rivers, lots of trees, a lot of tree lines, very big forest in this area, and the Ukrainians do have possibilities to stretch their forces in this area to concentrate a critical mass for further offensive operation. So we'll see what the Russians are able to do in this sector. And as you can see, there are very heavy bombardments of the cities like Inzhinierная, Kherson, and Sadova. And the main reason of all these bombardments is that the Ukrainians, when they use the landing operation, they're not packing their boats, let's say, somewhere here. So we will never see the operation that Ukrainians will take their boats and will start from here, and then they will cross the river and they will land their infantry here. The Ukrainians are not doing like this because it's too dangerous. If the Ukrainians want to land their infantry, for example, in this direction, they're using the river Ingulets. This is the river, and the Ukrainians usually, let's say, take their boats somewhere here, and then from this area they start movements on the boats. They're bypassing very big distances, then they're entering Dnipro river somewhere in the vicinity of Sadova, and only after that they're making the landing operation. So this is the first Ukrainian route of landing operations. This is the second area in the vicinity of Tyaginka. Usually the Ukrainians get their boats somewhere here. They're also making a very long trip, and only after this very long trip they're landing their infantry on the Russian bank of the river. And as you can see, based on that, we can see the Ukrainian problems, Ukrainian logistics, and Ukrainian possibilities. There are not so many places where the Ukrainians can use these tactics, and when talking about Adragdakamyanka-Burgunka, they also have a river here, and they can use this, let's say, landing road as well, but for some reason the Ukrainians are not using this territory for creation of the bridgehead in the vicinity of Korsunka. And the main reason of that is, first of all, that boats, and you need a lot of boats, you need to bring lots of equipment, and you need to pack equipment to boats, so usually it takes time. And if the Ukrainians can do this very far from the combat line, they have electronic warfare equipment, and basically they are secured from the air. And if the Ukrainians want to do such operation, like let's say in the vicinity of Ivanovka, of course, they will be destroyed by FPV drone while they're on the, let's say, on the bank of the river. So the Ukrainians are limited in these operations, and these are just 3 sectors, 3 areas where the Ukrainians can make this landing operation. Maybe they have possibility to do the same in the vicinity of Belozerka, but they can't do this for now because most of the islands on the south of this area are under Russian control. So before making this landing operation, first of all, the Ukrainians need to clear these territories, and only after that they can start, like say, landing operation attempts to create the foothold on the Russian bank of the river in the vicinity of Gola Pristan, Stara Zhburivka, and so on. But we remember that during the previous phase, the Ukrainians managed to get some success in this area. They managed to capture, and currently the Ukrainians, as I understand, have already launched this clearing operation in the islands, but obviously it will take few months before they finish, so the Russians can be sure that this sector is secured, and the Ukrainians need too much time, let's say, to clear this territory. So one more time, just 3 areas for this operation. Maybe the Ukrainians have some possibilities in to the north in direction of Kachkaryevka, let's say Chervony Mayaki, but it's too far from the main combat line, and the river is too wide in this area, and also not just too wide because of like destroyed Kakhovka Dam. Currently the terrain and the configuration of the ground in this area is unknown. Maybe the next year the Ukrainians will make some attempts to do the same from this direction, but for now they don't have such possibilities. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for your watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.